Heavenly Father, I just pray that you would teach us from what you have done in church history, Lord, for your people. We just pray that we would worship you more as a result of knowing how you interact with your people and how you're faithful to your promises, Lord. And we pray that in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so this week we are looking at the 600s, the 7th century. It's another big century. There's a lot going on. The Byzantine Empire in the east, the Eastern Roman Empire, now the Byzantine Empire, is beset by enemies, as often it is. It begins the century fighting the Persian Empire, the Sassanid Empire that's known as, and they have some success against them, but then just as they have time to celebrate their success against the Persians, lo, arises in the east a little person called Muhammad, and the rise of the Arabs and Islam means that the rest of the century is going to be dominated by the rise of Islam and how that takes over chunks of the Byzantine Empire and actually makes it all the way up into Spain and then almost into France in the 700s. We're going to look at that next week, actually, so we'll save kind of the story of how that goes down until next week. In the Eastern, that's the Eastern Empire. In the West, you've got various things going on because obviously the Western Empire is disintegrated. You've got your kingdoms that took over from the Western Roman Empire. In Italy, Lombards have been invading for the preceding 100 years or so, and most of Italy is now under Lombard control. But even so, the Byzantine Empire has a little toehold in a few places in Italy, like Ravenna, which is up in the north. And there's the exarchate who's sent there by the Byzantine Empire, and he actually has a large amount of control over parts of Italy, including what goes on in the papacy. So this period is known as the Byzantine papacy because the Byzantine emperor actually has control over who gets to be pope. Like the pope has to get permission to take his position from the Byzantine Empire, and that is the situation from the end of the 400s all the way into the mid-700s. So this whole century is the papacy is dominated by the Byzantine emperor, and we'll see that as we get into a little bit of theological controversy later on this morning. In Spain, you've got chaps like Isidore of Seville and others. They're having a little bit of a kind of a renaissance of learning and literature. He's a prolific author, and after Spain had converted from Arianism to Orthodox Christianity, you get this kind of flourishing of learning, and there's a lot of councils, the councils of Toledo, where they kind of managed to continue that process of conversion from Arianism to Orthodox Christianity. But all of that is kind of undone as the Arabs invade North Africa and then up into Spain. So they get that flourishing of learning, and then almost as quickly as it arises, it's quashed again by the Islamic invasions of southern Spain in the 600s. You've also got the Frankish kingdoms kind of doing their thing. The Merovingian dynasty is kind of having a lot of infighting in what is modern-day France and Holland. But the area that I want to focus on today is a little island to the northwest of Europe. Some people say it's part of Europe. Great Britain. Because actually, we have sources for the history of Britain in the 600s. And so it's kind of a place where there's a lot going on, and we know what was going on very well because a chap called Bede wrote a chronicle about the history of England in the 600s. And he actually called his history the ecclesiastical history of the people of England, because basically his entire history is really just about what happened in the church in the 600s. So we know a lot about that, and it's actually quite significant because if you look up most textbooks about the Anglo-Saxon period in Britain, this will probably have a chapter, the 600s will probably have a chapter saying the conversion of England, because this is when Christianity really comes to Britain in a concerted effort from the papacy with missionaries that are sent, and Christianity really takes off in England. And that is important for everyone in this room because if you are a Christian today in an English-speaking world, in an English-speaking country, then you can trace your lineage back to what happened in these decades of the 600s. So yeah, let's just jump straight into the story of the conversion of England. It's a fascinating one, and it begins with a very amusing pun. Gregory the Great, Pope, in the 590s, is walking around Rome, and he comes to a slave market, and he sees some slaves that were being sold, some young boys, and he notices that they have fair hair, blue eyes, they look really nice, he says. So he asks one of the people that's with him, he asks them this question. This is the story as told by Bede. He says, "From what region or country were these young men brought?" And he was told, "From the island of Britain, and that the inhabitants were like that in appearance." He again inquired whether those islanders were Christians or still involved in the errors of paganism, and was informed that they were pagans. Then, fetching a deep sigh from the bottom of his heart, "Alas, what a pity," he said, "that the author of darkness should own men of such fair countenances, and that with such grace of outward form their minds should be void of inward grace." He therefore again asked, "What was the name of that nation?" And was answered, "They are called Angles." "Right," he said, "for they have an angelic face, and it is meet that they should be co-heirs with the angels in heaven." "What is the name of the province from which they are brought?" It was replied that the natives of that province were called Di-Iri. "Truly they are Di-Ira," said he, which means saved from wrath and called to the mercy of Christ. "How is the king of that place called?" They told him his name was Aili, and he, playing on the name, said, "Alleluia! The praise of God, the Creator, must be sung in those parts." So that's kind of the story of how the seed was planted in Gregory's mind to send a mission to convert these people that he'd heard of called the Angles. The Angles were a tribe that had invaded England in the preceding century, and they were predominantly pagan. So that's how the seed was planted in Gregory's mind. No one knows if that's true story or not, but people have repeated it so many times that we really wish it was true, because it's great. Everyone loves a good pun. But that was not actually the first time that Christianity had come to the British Isles. So let me just quickly go through how Christianity, or the state of Christianity in the British Isles before Gregory's mission in the 590s. So the first mention of any Christianity in the British Isles was in around 208. A chap called Tertullian, who we looked at a few weeks ago, just makes a throwaway comment that there are places beyond the reach of Romans that have yet been conquered by Christ. So even places where the Roman Empire hadn't quite got, which is basically halfway up Britain, even Christians were to be found beyond the borders of the Roman Empire. So there's a little hint that even in the early 200s, there are Christians in Britain. In 230, Origen, another author that we looked at earlier a few weeks ago, he does specifically mention that there are Christians in Britain, although we don't at this stage have any names or any more information about that. It's not until the 300s that we begin to get a picture of what might be going on, because in 314, there are 3 bishops from the British Isles that attend a council in Arles, which is in modern-day France. No bishops from Britain go to the Council of Nicaea in 325, but Athanasius does mention that the British bishops accepted Nicaea. So at this point, the 300s, there are bishops, and they are Orthodox Christians, not Arians, in the 300s. And it's at that time that we have the first British martyr. You may have heard of him, St. Alban. He's martyred under the Diocletian persecution in the early 300s in a place called Verulamium, which is a Roman city at the time. It's now called St. Albans, slightly to the north of London. It's a lovely place. If you're ever in London, take a day trip to St. Albans. You will not be disappointed by that. St. Alban was the first English martyr. And also at this time in the 300s, you begin to see archaeological evidence of Christianity in Britain. So it's not just these written sources that mention that there are Christians, but there's actually physical evidence that we can dig up. There's a few Roman chapels left in Britain, but most significantly, there's a very famous mosaic from a villa. The south of England was kind of covered with Roman aristocratic villas, and one of them has a very famous mosaic that was on a wall that has the Chi Rho symbol, which is the first two letters of the Greek alphabet, Chi, not the Greek alphabet, first Greek letters of Jesus' name, C and R, Chi and Rho, it's like the X, it looks like a P and an X. And that was placed in someone's villa in about 345, people think. So there's evidence that Christians were meeting in these villas, using them as their churches, or perhaps it was someone's private chapel. Either way, there is physical evidence of Christianity in the mid-300s in Britain. The first person that we have a name of who was a, quote, inverted commas, quote, Christian, was Pelagius, who we talked about a couple of weeks ago, the great heretic. He was from Great Britain, but went into Rome, and he was the guy that propagated his heresy, Pelagianism. And surprise, surprise, because he was from Britain, Pelagianism actually was quite popular in Great Britain in the 400s. It wasn't quite yet the Frankish kingdom, but so there were some bishops from what is now France. Germanus, bishop of Auxerre, and Lupus, bishop of Troyes, were sent to kind of quash the Pelagian controversy in Britain. And they were very enigmatic figures. It's kind of they're kind of funny guys. Germanus, his method of converting people was to charge into battle with a bag of relics around his neck, crying "Hallelujah" as he fought the Picts and the various British tribes that were up in the north of the country. So that's one method of conversion, missionary activity, and that's actually a theme. A lot of bishops, not very peaceful. Well, they were peaceful in some respects, but many bishops took up arms in these early days of interactions with pagan tribes in Britain as Anglo-Saxon bishops. They were either at the battle praying, or they were happy to take up arms and fight. So that's kind of a theme in Anglo-Saxon Christian history. Moving quickly on and to the 380s, we begin to see monasticism come to the British Isles. A chap called St. Ninian. Ninian was a disciple of St. Martin, who we looked at last week, or I don't remember which week it was, a couple of weeks ago. St. Martin in the Frankish kingdom, he was a disciple of his, brought monasticism to Galloway, which is now modern-day south-west Scotland. I always get the east and west, but southwest of Scotland. And you can go and see the cave that he lived in. He lived in a cave on a beach, and people still go there today, St. Ninian's cave, or what they think might have been his cave. But by far the more famous chap at this time in the early 400s is a chap called St. Patrick. You may have heard of him. St. Patrick, patron saint of Ireland, not Irish at all. He was actually from England, possibly Wales, what is now Wales. And he was taken as slave by Irish tribesmen, taken over to Ireland. He escapes, but loved his captors so much, or cared for their souls so much, that he actually went back over to Ireland to minister to them and becomes Bishop of Ireland in 432. And he's significant because he kind of begins a movement in Ireland that is going to kind of cross over the sea and come down into northern England in the next few centuries. Celtic Christianity is what it's kind of referred to, and it's slightly... people debate how different it is or was to the kind of predominant Roman Christianity at the time. They were both orthodox in their belief about Trinity and Jesus' person, but they had slightly different practices about how you kind of ran a monastery, how you set up a bishopric. For instance, in Celtic Christianity, the abbot of a monastery actually had higher authority than bishops. And bishops didn't have territories like they do under the Roman system. They actually just kind of wandered from place to place. They didn't have a specific see that they were bishop of. Things like that kind of set Celtic Christianity apart from the predominant Roman Christianity. But Celtic Christianity has had a huge impact on the history of the church, mainly through kind of romantic images of what it was, what it looked like, and some of its artwork, because there is around you right now a little remnant of Celtic Christianity in this very church. Our logo has a Celtic cross. Shem Creek Presbyterian Church symbolised with a Celtic cross there. So that is probably the way that most people know Celtic Christianity, is through the kind of artwork that was produced. Fascinating stuff. Look up the life of St. Patrick. Very aesthetic guy. Probably the most famous thing these days is, because of Star Wars, the hermit huts on Skellig Michael. That's an example of how harsh the monastic rules were that were popular in Ireland in the 400s. Building a little beehive hut out of slate on the side of a very remote island to the north of Ireland, out in the sea. That was kind of an example of how they would go to the extremes in their devotion to the monastic life. So that's kind of the situation in the 400s, when the Roman legions leave Britain. The Roman Empire is collapsing in the 400s, and the decision is taken they're not going to defend the extremities of the empire anymore, and the last Roman legions leave Great Britain in the 430s or so. And as they do that, you basically have some aristocratic Roman Christians that live in what is now England and Wales, and you have this kind of emerging Celtic Christianity that I was just talking about in Ireland. And that's what's going on in the 400s. Before, there's only a few decades before, the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes turn up. These are tribes from northern Germany now, what is now northern Germany, and they invade Britain in the 450s through the 500s. And there's a great debate as to exactly how they got there. Historians argue, was it in a great wave of migration, or was it slowly, bit by bit, small bands come? So, however they did get there, it's clear that they did get there. So by the 500s, the whole island of Great Britain is kind of taken by these tribes, Angles, Saxons, and the Jutes. And the people that had lived there, the British, are kind of pushed down into what is now Cornwall and Wales. So why does Wales have a different language, Welsh? Well, it's because basically the original inhabitants of the island were, kind of fled to the mountains of Wales as the Angles and the Saxons invaded, and you have way more remnants of that Gaelic language in Welsh, and actually Cornwall has its own language, Cornish. There's lots of place names and things that kind of indicate that that's where the British people went when the Angles and the Saxons turned up. And those Angles and those Saxons were pagan, so Christianity kind of really gets put on the down low, underground. There's just a few British Christians hanging on, but basically the entire country, the entire island, is now pagan, and no one really knows exactly what those pagans believed. Most people think it's something akin to what the Vikings and the Danes believed, kind of Woden and Thor and all those sorts of gods, but much more than that. No one really knows what the Angles and Saxons believed, but it wasn't Christianity. So that's what's going on in the 500s. Let's go all the way now to 560. We're almost getting back to Gregory and his mission. In 560, there was an abbot in Ireland called Columba, Saint Columba, as he's now known. And basically, he got into a strange argument with another monastery over the ownership of a manuscript, a very important manuscript. And this argument got so out of hand that there was a tribal war that took place in Ireland. And in that war, Columba was just kicked out of Ireland. He had to leave. So he gets on a boat, sails over to what is now Scotland, and the first island he comes to, or the first land that he comes to where he cannot any longer see Ireland, the place Ireland, he sets up a monastery. And that monastery is known as Iona, very famous monastery, you've probably heard of that. Iona, Columba sets that up. And from there, he is able to send out missionaries into northern England and southern Scotland. And he has a fair amount of success in that ministry. He is known to charge around with the message, "Christ is my druid." That is what he would say to people. And there's a kind of interesting example there of contextualization of the gospel, because think about these guys that he's ministering to. Picts, basically, it was the tribe in southern Scotland. They didn't know what a Jew was. They didn't know anything about the Old Testament. They didn't know anything about even Roman history. So all of basically any sort of way that you could talk about Christianity to them made absolutely no sense. So Columba came up with this idea that Jesus is a little bit like a druid. So that was kind of his way to explain the gospel to them. And that kind of becomes a bit of a theme in the missions too, that Anglo-Saxons and the pagan tribes, an attempt to try and explain Christianity in a way that they could possibly understand. So in Anglo-Saxon Christianity, you get a lot about Jesus actually being a warrior, which is kind of strange to us to think of it the ultimate example of humility. Well, there's lots of poetry that actually says much more about Jesus being the great warrior that wrestles death to death on the cross. There's a really famous, or sort of famous poem called "The Poem of the Rood," where the cross kind of has a voice and tells a story about how one day this young man, this great warrior, comes and fights death on him. The cross speaking about the experience of having Jesus crucified on his own person. It's a very interesting poem. Poem of the Rood. I recommend looking that up. Very interesting. So there you have. That's the situation in the 500s, just before Gregory sends his mission into southern England. So you have a kind of a pincer movement is about to happen, where you have this Celtic Christianity from Iona coming in from the north of England, and Gregory's going to send his mission, and that's going to come in from the south, and they're going to meet, and there's going to be conflict. But how does Gregory's mission come about? We talked about how the seed was planted in Gregory's mind with the slaves that he met in the slave market. But initially, his plan is to buy those slaves. So he buys lots of these young boys and trains them up in his monasteries and to send them back to England so they could be salt and light in their pagan communities. It doesn't take off very well, so he has a more concerted effort where he actually gathers together some clergymen who are going to go and set up a church. You could call it a church plant if you wanted to. He chooses a chap called Augustine, who was the abbot of Gregory's monastery on Gregory's private estate in Rome. St. Augustine of Canterbury, not to be confused with St. Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine of Canterbury. And he is sent to minister to the kingdom of Kent, one of the many kingdoms at the time, which is in the very southeast of England. His group gets very afraid when they're on their way. They're traveling from Rome to England, and they get scared. They think, oh my word, what have we taken on here? These pagan people, they're just going to kill us. So they write back to Gregory and say, we can't do it. This is a terrible idea, let's just leave them. And Gregory sends them a letter saying this: for as much as it had been better not to begin a good work than to think of deserting from one which has already begun, it behooves you, my beloved sons, to fulfill with all diligence the good work which by the help of the Lord you have undertaken. Let not therefore the toil of the journey, nor the tongues of evil-speaking men discourage you, but with all earnestness and zeal perform by God's guidance that which you have been set about, being assured that a great labour is followed by the greater glory of an eternal reward. So Gregory basically says to them, no, you're going. Don't stop now. And they don't. That letter rallies their spirits, and they cross over from the Frankish kingdom into southeastern England, and lo and behold, they didn't need to be scared at all, because it just so happened that the King of Kent had married a few years earlier a wife who was a Christian. So actually, he was aware of Christianity, and the Queen of Kent was actually had a church already existing. That church was called St. Martin's Church, and it's still there today. Slightly changed around a little bit in Canterbury. I've been there myself. It's very nice, and it has the great. What's the right word? It is the oldest continually used church in England. So every Sunday since the 590s, there's been a service there. So that's pretty cool. I don't know if they still count that with COVID, because there was a little gap there, but that is the oldest continually used church in England, St. Martin's in Canterbury. So yeah, anyway, Augustine turns up with his band of followers, and the king knows about Christianity, but he's a little bit suspicious of it. He's a kind of superstitious guy. He's kind of scared of Christians because he's heard of all the miracles that they can do. So he has a meeting with Augustine out in the open. If he's indoors, he thinks that Augustine could work some magic on him. So he meets Augustine in the open. Augustine explains the gospel to the king of Kent, whose name is Ethelbert. And Ethelbert is fairly receptive to it, actually. So he gives Augustine a little bit of land in Canterbury to set up a church and to conduct his missions around the kingdom. And Augustine, by all accounts, has a lot of success in Kent. By Christmas of the year 597, which is the year he turned up, he writes to Gregory to say he's baptized 10,000 converts. He's probably over-exaggerating a little bit, but either way, he's fairly well received in the Kingdom of Kent. And Gregory writes to Augustine with some advice about how to proceed in his mission to the Anglo-Saxons. Some of it's good, some of it was badly received. It actually has a fairly kind attitude towards the Angles, knowing that they would have, and the missionaries, knowing that they are going into an alien context. He says that they can be flexible with the liturgy. It gives them a lot of breadth to kind of contextualize what they do and when they do it and how they do it, so as not to offend anyone or upset anyone. But as the British Christians that are existing, he has less time for, and he says that Augustine has authority over any existing British Christians, any bishops that might still be around, and that causes friction, obviously, because this guy comes in and he's immediately exalted over the people that were already there, hanging on in a pagan country. In 604, bishopric is set up in Rochester, which is just on the mouth of the Thames estuary, and then a few months later, one is set up in London, a bishopric in London. And London is not the capital of England at this time. It's just that is the border. That's the northern border of the Kentish kingdom. The northern border is the southern bank of the Thames, and there's not much success at getting past the Kentish kingdom. Kentish kingdom, the Augustine mission does very well, and lots of conversions, but they don't really ever penetrate into any of the other kingdoms, which is bad, because when Ethelbert dies, King of Kent dies in 616, his son takes over, Eadbald, and he is not a Christian. He does not like Christianity. So the king takes over, and that kind of spells a little bit of disaster for the mission, St. Augustine's mission. Christianity still holds on, but obviously a lot of the people that converted to Christianity did so to win favour with the king, so a lot of them convert back. So there's a real setback. The next kind of stage moving forwards with the conversion of England doesn't really happen until a few decades later, when a chap called Paulinus, who was one of Augustine's followers, is sent on a mission with the princess of Kent, Ethelberga, lovely name, Ethelberga. She is sent to be the bride of the king of Northumbria. Northumbria was a kingdom that was basically the northern counties of England, southern counties of Scotland. Ethelberga, is sent up to be the bride of King Edwin of Northumbria, and Paulinus is sent with her to be kind of her chaplain and also to kind of sneakily convert the Northumbrians. And when he gets there, he has a council with the king of Northumbria, Edwin, and the king gets together all his friends, all of his advisors, to hear what St. Paulinus has to say. And it's quite a famous council because, Edwin is very receptive to what Paulinus has to say. And one of Edwin's advisors has this great quote that he says this. One of the advisors to the king says, "The present life of man upon earth, O king, seems to me, in comparison with that time which is unknown to us, like the swift flight of a sparrow through the house wherein you sit at supper in winter with your ealdormen and thanes, while the fire blazes in the midst and the hall is warmed, but the wintry storms of rain or snow are raging abroad, the sparrow flying in at one door immediately and out the other, whilst he is within, is safe from the wintry tempest. But after a short space of fair weather, he is immediately vanishes out of your sight, passing from winter into winter again. So this life of man appears for a little while, but of what is to follow, or what went before, we know nothing at all. If therefore this new doctrine tells us something more certain, it seems justly to deserve to be followed. So there is a great poetic metaphor that this guy has. Life to them, these pagans living in this wet, windy island, Britain, is just like a flash of life, and no one knows where did we come from and where do you go. And here comes this Paulinus and has some answers. So he's basically saying, hey, look, if Christianity can tell us some truth about what happens after this life, perhaps we should give it some time and we should listen to what this guy has to say. And actually, the king agrees, and so does the chief druid, the chief pagan druid guy called Kofi. He was so taken up by what Paulinus says that after the meeting, he grabs his horse, his ceremonial horse, his spear, and he charges down the road to the shrine, their local kind of temple shrine thing, and throws his spear through the door, which is kind of like the ultimate act of desecration by the chief druid there. So Christianity is well received in Northumbria, and Paulinus has a lot of success converting the Northumbrians. Again, the exact same thing happens though. King Edwin was Christian, and that was great, but in 634 he's killed. He's killed by some pagans, and they take over the Northumbrian kingdom, and obviously in that context, Christianity again dies down a little bit in Northumbria. But it's okay because Edwin, before he died, realised things were not going his way. So he sent his son Oswald to Iona, which we mentioned earlier, sent his son Oswald to Iona. And there he grows up to be a Christian. And once he's old enough, he comes back and reclaims his throne in the kingdom of Northumbria, defeats the heathen army, the pagan army, and he sets up, after doing that, he sets up another monastery called Lindisfarne, which is, if anything, maybe even more famous than Iona. And you'll know it because of the Lindisfarne Gospels that they produced, a great centre of culture and learning. You've probably seen the Lindisfarne Gospels. And Lindisfarne kind of acts as a little bit like an Iona, just slightly further south and to the east of England. From there, a chap called St. Aidan is able to send out missions into Northumbria, and he just marches around the countryside in a very romantic fashion with followers of monks, and they chant the Psalms. Everywhere they go, they walk around chanting the Psalms, and they have a fair amount of success converting the Northumbrians. But like I said, there's conflict because he had Paulinus come up from the south after the Augustan mission, and he follows the Roman pattern of doing things, and Aidan and his followers from Lindisfarne, they follow the Celtic pattern of doing things. So there's a little bit of friction, and this comes to a head when in the 660s, King Oswy is a chap who comes to the throne of Northumbria. King Oswy, he follows the Celtic pattern of Christianity. His wife follows the Roman, so that's not going to work. So they have to put this to rest. There's a synod. There's a very famous synod called the Synod of Whitby in 663. It was presided over by an abbess called Hilda, abbess of a monastery in Whitby, obviously, Synod of Whitby. She was the abbess of a monastery there, which is interesting because in Anglo-Saxon Christianity, women actually had a lot of the same amount of authority as a male abbot. So you actually have a council of the church that's presided over by a woman, Saint Hilda, and she's a very interesting lady. So basically, so there's this debate between Celtic Christianity and Roman Christianity. What does that mean? Well, basically, it sounds very superficial to us now, but basically the main contention was the date of Easter. The Celts calculated Easter at a very different date, not very different, it's just several weeks later, than the Roman system. And also, the monks shaved their head in a different way. Romans shaved their head in a circle here and then just kept the hair around like that. Celts shaved the front. So they had half bald that way and then hair at the back. So things like that sounds kind of superficial to us, but to them it was all about authority. Who has authority? And surprise, surprise, Rome felt like it had the authority to say how you shaved your head and when you celebrated Easter. So there's this synod and the two sides debate. And basically, the way that Bede recounts it, the Romans won almost exclusively on one point. They win because they have Peter and Paul on their side. The Romans are able to say, we have St. Peter and St. Paul. Who have you got? And the Celts say, well, we have Columba. And they're like, Columba's good, but he's not an apostle. So that's kind of how the argument's won. So the Roman system is imposed upon the Celtic church. So from now on, the Celts have to have obedience to the Pope in Rome and follow all of the Roman rules about how to do monasticism and how to celebrate the Mass with one priest, not two, some things like that. And it's kind of 50-50 whether the Celts took that or not. Half of them go back to Iona, pack up Iona, move back to Ireland, just continue doing their thing. But some stay in Lindisfarne, and the guy that stays in Lindisfarne is also a huge figure, St. Cuthbert. He's a very important guy in this story. And St. Cuthbert is a very popular name of churches to this day in Scotland. In fact, the Free Church of Scotland, which is our sister denomination, or we have kind of good relations with the Free Church of Scotland, is the kind of most Orthodox Presbyterian denomination in Scotland. Their main church, their kind of mother church, if you want to call it that, in Edinburgh is called St. Cuthbert's. So his memory lives on, but most people remember him because Bede writes a life about him, and he does loads and loads of miracles. It's basically just one miracle after another, and one story about how harsh he was to himself and another, because he's kind of famous for standing in the sea overnight, the freezing cold North Sea overnight. That's what he would do. That was his form of devotion, to go and stand in the sea, and then once he came out of the sea, some friendly otters would come and dry his feet, because apparently he was so holy he could talk to animals, and he could talk to the sea otters, and they would come and dry his feet for him. So that's kind of like the story that everyone knows about St. Cuthbert. But he was not just, he did not just do that. He was also a missionary monk, and sent out missions, continued to send out missions from Lindisfarne, and they did have a fair amount of success in the kingdom of Northumbria. The time, we're coming up on time ourselves, but the period after the Synod of Whitby in 663 rather, is kind of dominated by a very interesting guy called St. Theodore of Tarsus. And he's interesting because he's from Tarsus, which is where Paul is from. Is in Turkey, modern day Turkey, is a Greek part of the world, Greek-speaking part of the world. And the Pope sends this Greek speaker to this windy, cold, rainy island to the northeast of Europe in order to kind of shore up Roman control of the church in Great Britain. And Theodore has a lot of success. He kind of introduces some reforms in education and centralizes the church very effectively, organizes the church, sets up synods, local synods, enforces the council or the Synod of Whitby, the findings of the Synod of Whitby on the church in Britain, and kind of stabilizes the church in England, really. So much so that there's kind of a renaissance, if you like, a flourishing of learning and education when he was Archbishop of Canterbury, which is kind of the tail end of which will be when St. Bede is writing his history of everything that I've just been talking about. So he's a very important guy, St. Theodore of Tarsus. And in 680, he calls a synod at a place called Hatfield to address a heresy that had been going on in the Eastern Roman Empire called monothelitism. And in that synod, they condemn monothelitism. And I was going to tell you a lot about monothelitism, but I've run out of time, so I'll just tell you in the most briefest of definitions. What on earth is monothelitism? Well, in the Eastern Empire, what has been going on is, if you remember, in the last couple of weeks we talked about the Council of Chalcedon, and how there was Monophysite Christians that continued in Egypt and Syria, and they believed that Jesus had one nature. Well, in order to keep those people on side, when the Arabs were invading and before the Arabs, when they were fighting the Persians, they came up, or the Patriarch of Constantinople, Sergius I, came up with this definition where he said, okay, let's say there's two natures, but there's only one will. He originally says there's one energy, but that doesn't go down well. So he says there's one will. So two natures, one will. That is seen to confuse the natures too much. There needs to be two wills, fully human will, fully divine will, working in unison. So that is defeated at the Sixth Ecumenical Council in 680. The Third Council of Constantinople is defeated there. So that's what monothelitism is. And if we had time, I would have gone into it a little bit better. But that's kind of vaguely what was going on there. Any questions or comments before we let in the rest of